until we fully achieve the motto engraved in Vermont marble above the Supreme Court building that declares equal justice under the law. I'll continue to fight for the equal treatment of all Americans. And, Mr. President, I yield the floor and ask consent that we go back out of morning business.
Without objection. Mr. President. Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, over the last few days, I've received numerous emails and calls from conservatives and Tea Party activists from across the country regarding immigration. Their opinions really matter to me, because they were with me 3 years ago when so many people here in Washington and in Florida, for that matter, thought I had no chance to win my election. Let me begin by saying these people are patriots. They're everyday Americans from all walks of life who are deeply concerned about the direction that our country is headed. And they're increasingly unhappy about the immigration reform proposal in the Senate. It's not because they're anti-immigrant, as some on the left like to say. It's not because they're closed-minded. They believe, as I do, that as a sovereign country, we have a right to secure our borders, that we have a right to have immigration laws and to enforce them. And they're increasingly opposed to this effort because for over 3 decades, and despite many promises to enforce the law, the federal government, under both Republicans and Democrats, have failed to do so. In the end, it isn't just immigration reform itself that worries them. It's that the government has failed them so many times before. They realize we have a legal immigration system that needs reform. They realize that we have over 11 million people currently living in our country illegally and that we have to deal with them. They just simply believe that no matter what law we pass, we cannot trust the federal government to ever actually enforce it. This sentiment was best summed up for me in an email that I received from Sharon Calvert, who's a prominent Tea Party leader in Tampa, Florida. Here's what she wrote. She said, "Today, June 2013, we're in a very different political climate than we were after the last election. We are in a political climate of distrust of government and elected representatives at its highest." She goes on to say, "Do we want to trust this administration to faithfully enforce a bill to the best interests of all Americans with a bill that so few have read?" End quote. She makes a powerful point. They're finding out that the IRS investigates people based on their political views, of all the questions that remain about Benghazi, and seeing the Justice Department target reporters. Trust in the federal government is rightfully at an all-time low. I share the skepticism about this administration and Washington in general. In just the 2 years that I've been here, I have seen the games that are played and the promises that are broken, and how the American people ultimately suffer the consequences. And that's exactly what led me to get involved in this issue in the first place. We have a badly broken legal immigration system. Not only one that does not work, it actually encourages illegal immigration. We have a border with Mexico that, despite billions of dollars that have already been spent, it's still not secure. Every day, people and drugs and guns are trafficked across the border. And we have 11 million people living in this country illegally in de facto amnesty. What I'm describing, this is the way things are now. This is the status quo. And it is a terrible mess. It is hurting our country terribly. And unless we do something about it, this administration isn't going to fix it. Now, political pundits, they love to focus on the politics of all this. But for me, this isn't about catering to any group for political gain. Predictably, despite all the work that we've done on immigration reform, some so-called pro-immigrant groups continue to protest me daily. This isn't about winning points from the establishment or the mainstream media either, by the way. No matter how consistent I have been in focusing on the border security aspects of reform, whenever I've spoken about it, the Beltway media has accused me of trying to undermine or walk away from this reform. This isn't about becoming a Washington deal-maker. Truthfully, it would have been a lot easier to just sit back, vote against any proposal, and give speeches about how I would have done it differently. And finally, this certainly isn't about gaining support for future office. Many conservative commentators and leaders, people who I deeply respect, and with whom I agree on virtually every other issue, are disappointed about my involvement in this debate. See, I got involved in this issue for one simple reason. I ran for office to try and fix things that are hurting this special country. And in the end, that's what this is about for me. Trying to fix a serious problem that faces America. The proposal before the Senate is by no means perfect. Like any proposal that will come before the Senate, it has flaws. But it also has important reforms that conservatives have been trying to get for years. For example, it changes our legal immigration system from a predominantly family-based system of chain migration to a merit-based system that focuses on job skills. This proposal mandates the most ambitious border and interior security measures in our nation's history. For example, it requires and funds the completion of 700 miles of real border fence. It adds 20,000 new border agents. It details a specific technology plan for each sector of the border. It requires E-Verify for every employer in America, and it creates a tracking system to identify people who overstay their visas. These are all things that, at a minimum, must happen before those in the country illegally can apply for permanent status. And the proposal deals with those who are here illegally in a reasonable but responsible way. Right now, those here illegally are living in de facto amnesty. This is what I mean by that. They're unregistered, many pay no taxes, and few will ever have to pay a price for having violated our laws. Under this bill, they will have to come forward. They will have to pass background checks. They will have to pay a fine. They will have to start paying taxes. And they will be ineligible for welfare, for food stamps, and for Obamacare. And in return, the only thing they get is a temporary work permit. And they can't renew it in 6 years unless they can prove that they've been holding a job and paying their taxes. For at least 10 years, that's all they can have. And after that, after all that, they can't even apply for permanent status until the fence is built, the Border Patrol agents are hired, and the border security technology, E-Verify, and the tracking system are fully in place. Yet despite all these measures, opposition from many conservatives has grown significantly in the last few weeks. Why? Well, because they've heard that the Secretary of Homeland Security can just ignore the border requirement. But this is not true. The department does have the discretion on where to build the fence, but not on the amount of fencing it must build. At the end of the day, it is simple. 700 miles of pedestrian fencing must be built. They've also heard that the Secretary of Homeland Security can just waive the radars and the drones and the ground sensors and the other technology required in the bill. But that's just not true. The Secretary can always add more to the plan, but the list of border security measures we mandate in the legislation is the minimum that must be implemented. Some oppose it because they've heard that a future Congress can just defund all the security measures, like they've done in the past. But that's just not true. The money is built into the bill. Unlike previous border security laws, it doesn't leave it dependent on future funding. They also oppose the bill because they've heard that it creates a taxpayer subsidy for people to buy a car or a scooter. That's just not true. Nothing in this bill allows that. And finally, they oppose the bill because they've heard that last Friday, a brand new 1,100-page bill that no one has read is what now is before the Senate. That's just not true. This is the exact same bill that's been publicly available for 10 weeks. The main addition to it are about 120 pages of border security. Because in order to add 700 miles of fence, 20,000 border agents, and a prohibition on things like foreign students or tourists from getting Obamacare, we had to add pages to the bill. Now, I understand, I do, why after reading these false claims, people would be opposed to this bill. And I understand why after we've been burned by large bills in the past, people are suspicious of big reforms of any kind. And I understand why after promises made in the past on immigration that have not been kept, people doubt whether they'll ever be kept again in the future. But I also understand what's going to happen if at some point we do not come up with an agreement we can support on immigration reform. What's going to happen is we'll still have a broken legal immigration system. We won't have more Border Patrol officers. We won't have enough fencing. We still won't have mandatory E-Verify. And we'll still have 11 million people living here illegally. And that's why I'm involved in this. Because despite all the problems we have with government, the only way to mandate a fence, E-Verify, and more agents is to pass a law that does so. Now, I knew getting these requirements into the bill would not be easy. This administration insisted the border is already secure. and they fought every effort to improve the border security parts of this bill. The administration wants the fastest and easiest path to citizenship possible, and they fought every condition and every trigger in this bill. But I got involved because I knew that if conservatives didn't get involved in shaping this proposal, it would not have any of the border security reforms that our nation desperately needs. Getting to this point has been very difficult. To hear the worry and the anxiety and the growing anger and the voices of so many people who helped me get elected to the Senate, who I agree with on virtually every other issue, it's been a real trial for me. I know they love America, and they're deeply worried about the direction that this administration is trying to take our country. But when I was a candidate, I told you I wanted to come here and fight. I wanted to fight to protect what's good for America and fight to stop what's bad for America. And I believe what we have now on immigration is hurting our country badly, and I simply wasn't going to just leave it to Democrats alone to figure out how to fix it. I guess perhaps at the heart of my support of this proposal is that I know firsthand that while immigrants have always impacted America, America changes immigrants even more. Just a generation ago, my parents lived in poverty in another country. But America changed them. It gave them a chance to improve their lives. It gave them the opportunity to open doors for me that were closed for them. And the longer they lived here, the older their kids got, the more conservative they became. The more convinced they became that limited government and free enterprise and our constitutional liberties made this nation special. I am a first-hand witness to the transformative power of our country, how it doesn't just change people's pocketbooks. It changes their hearts and their minds. And despite all the challenges and despite our broken government, I still believe this is that kind of country. And I realize that in the end, many of my fellow conservatives will not be able to support this reform. But I hope you will understand that I honestly believe that it's the right thing to do for this country. To finally have an immigration system that works. To finally have a fence. To finally have more agents and E-Verify. And to finally put an end to de facto amnesty. In my heart and in my mind, I know that we must solve this problem once and for all, or it will only get worse, and it will only get harder to solve. To my fellow conservatives, I will continue to fight alongside you for real tax reform, for lowering our debt, for balancing our budget, for reducing regulations, for rolling back job-killing environmental policies, and for repealing the disaster of Obamacare. To my fellow conservatives, I will continue to fight alongside you for the sanctity of life and for traditional marriage. But I will also continue to work in the hopes of one day uniting behind a common conservative strategy on how to fix our broken immigration system once and for all. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, I want to say how much I respect the senator from Florida. I respect his viewpoint. I respect the amount of effort he has put into this issue, which is a very difficult and a very complex issue. He speaks from the heart. I have never questioned his motives. And he has worked very, very hard to put together the very best piece of legislation I think that could have been accomplished on this Senate floor. I wish I could stand with him in terms of final support, because I too believe that our current system is broken, that it needs to be addressed. Status quo is not an option. We will continue down the same road and only to a greater degree than where we find ourselves today. But I'm deeply concerned here, and for me the most difficult of things to work through finally came down to the fact that, as Senator Rubio has talked about, there is a great level of distrust in this country today toward whatever comes out of Washington and whoever's mouth it comes out of. Some of this is due to, I think, certain events that have happened here in the last several months. Benghazi is still not settled. The American people still have not satisfied with what has been said about what happened exactly and what our response should have been. And there's been changing narratives. That feeds into the distrust. Certainly the scandals, the IRS scandal and others, continue to feed. And it's a very dangerous thing for a democracy when people have lost trust in their elected representatives, in their government. It's a very dangerous thing for the future. And we need to restore that. But to me, that element that now exists means that when we take up legislation, as comprehensive as this bill is, as sweeping as this bill is, we need to ensure that the American people understand it and that they have trust in us that what we promise we will do in this bill will be fulfilled. And all this, from my perspective, has to be measured against the 1986 Immigration Reform Act, which I voted for and supported. Ronald Reagan was president at the time. We had a divided Congress, Republicans and Democrats. The Senate was under one party and the House was under another. And so the situation was somewhat similar to today. But with the President's leadership and with the promises that were made that then 3 million people that were here illegally would be granted an opportunity to get on a path to citizenship. And it was combined with the fact that we promised in that bill, verbally and in language, that we would secure the border so we wouldn't have to deal with this again. Well, here we are in 2013 dealing with it again, but not 3 million, but 11 million and counting in terms of illegal immigration, and it's having enormous impact on our country. And it is an issue which we have to address. But I think we have to do it in a way that acknowledges that the promises made then were not fulfilled. And when added today to the promises and the things that have been said that have caused even a greater level of distrust than any of us could possibly imagine, that has to be addressed. And the way, in my opinion, to address that is, to borrow from Ronald Reagan, trust and verify. And I think verify now, because of this trust deficit, has to become first before people are ready to trust. They simply don't believe that the promises made here will work, that they will be fulfilled. When the underlying bill basically says the Secretary of Health and Human Services will state that HHS, Homeland Security, has a strategy to address the border security problem. That doesn't play very well with people who have seen strategies promised before. They want to see results. And the real issue here has been whether or not, at least for me and I think many of my colleagues, has been whether or not we are able to prove to the American people that they're going to get the results before we start a process in which moves people through a legalization process which we know we're never going to be able to pull back. There were some amendments offered here by my colleagues which I supported because essentially what they said was we want to look at results first before we begin the process of which we're never going to be able to pull back of legal status for illegals in this country. So it's that cart before the horse here that I think, for me at least, and I think for many of us, is the reason why we cannot support this bill as it's currently written. I hope the House will come forward with something more credible, perhaps more sequential, that addresses this very fundamental flaw in this bill, which is proving to the American people that we will fulfill the promises that we're making in this legislation before we start a process of granting legal status to illegals, so that we will not get years down the road only to find that we have not succeeded in fulfilling those promises, and yet we have created yet another amnesty situation, and we will not have secured what we want to do. I'm the son of an immigrant. My mother came here with her family. It's been the narrative in our family that legal immigration is what has made America the country that it is. And so I don't fear immigration. The diversity has been good for our country. I served as ambassador to Germany for 4 years, and I can't tell you how many Germans and Europeans from other countries came up and basically said, someday I hope to get in the lottery, that my name will be pulled. I've been in line for 15 years. I've been in line for 20 years, waiting to come to your country through a legal immigration process. It's pretty hard when you're the son of an immigrant, you know your family came here the right way, to know that there are millions of people in this world that would love to come to America and become responsible citizens, and yet to see them look at people flooding across the border and being granted that privilege, which they have not yet been able to attain. So I trust that we'll be able to go forward, trust the House will come forward with something that is more credible than what we're passing here. I voted earlier for procedural motion to proceed for debate on this issue because I thought we needed to have this debate. I was hoping through the amendment process we could address this fundamental issue, at least fundamental to me. The employee verification has been strengthened. The border security has been strengthened. The exit visa problem has been strengthened if the promises come true. But they've only been strengthened on a piece of paper. And we need to see it strengthened for real on the border, at the employment office, and at the exit visa offices on the portals for people coming in and out of this country. That is yet to be seen. That is yet to be demonstrated. And so without that fundamental, let's get this in place first and in order to restore that trust, which is so lacking in the American people, justified on the failures of Congress and the failures of this administration in particular, or any administration, to deliver what they said they would, to fulfill their promises. And so that is why I will not be supporting the bill. But I do hope, given the problems we have with the status quo, as I think clearly outlined by my colleague from Florida, we need to keep at this. We need to find the solution to the problem because America cannot continue to be the country that it is and be the country that we want it to be if we don't address this wound and this flaw in the current immigration system. We need people with skills at the high level that Americans cannot fill all those jobs. And until I hope our education system improves to the point where we can fill all those jobs. But some of our most important industries, pharmaceutical, software, and others, important to our national defense and national security, they need those employees coming here the legal way through the visas. We need some of the lower skilled people. I have a lot of processing plants in my state. I have a lot of agricultural sources in my state that cannot find enough American workers to fill the positions that they have offered. That ought to be addressed. I want to address that. So it's not simply someone standing up and saying, we don't have to fix the problem. We do have to fix the problem. I respect the efforts that have been made in a bipartisan way to try to do that. I just think this bill has one major fatal flaw, and that is the promises are not demonstrated, are not fulfilled before the process starts. And for that reason, I cannot support the bill in its final form. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I wish to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, I rise today to talk about college affordability and student loan interest rates. But before I begin, I'd like to take a moment to comment on the historic decision this morning by the Supreme Court. I've been married to my wife, Franny, for 37 years, It's the best thing that ever happened to me, and I have long believed that every loving couple should be seen as equal under the eyes of the law. And so I've been fighting for years, along with others, to overturn the so-called Defense of Marriage Act. I am very happy today that the court did so in part this morning. Today, all Minnesota couples will be treated equally under federal law, and this will make a real difference for those families. We still have work to do. I think that Americans should have the freedom to marry the person of their choosing, regardless of the state they live in. So we still have work to do, but today is a happy day. Okay, so back to college affordability and student loan interest rates. The interest rate on the Stafford subsidized loan is set to double on July 1st. Along with a number of my colleagues, I'm fighting to prevent that from happening and to reach an agreement to protect students and make college more affordable for them and for their families. Not long ago, I had a group of student leaders from MnSCU, a MnSCU system, Minnesota State Colleges and University. They came to my office here in D.C. To discuss college affordability. Now, remember, these are members of the student government of many of Minnesota's public colleges and universities. They're the student leadership, and there are about 20 of them. I asked them, how many of you work while you're going to school, while you're in college? Every one of them put their hand up. And I said, okay, how many of you work at least 20 hours a week? Most of them. How many of you work 30 hours a week while you're going to school? More than I expected. And then I asked, how many of you work full-time, work 40 hours a week while you're going to college? A number of them raised their hands. And mind you, these are the student leaders of these schools, so they also spend their time in student government. Now, working in college is not necessarily a bad thing. Some work can help students better manage their time, become more productive, and help pay for college. I worked during college. It was like 5 hours a week in our dorm kitchen. And evidence shows that when a student starts to work more than 15 hours a week, it becomes harder for the student to maintain good grades in school and to graduate from school on time. Students are working more because college is becoming less and less affordable, and they're still taking out more and more student loans and graduating with more and more debt. Minnesota has the unfortunate distinction of being the state with the third highest average debt for students graduating from college at over $30,000 a student. Whether these students are attending community college or a four-year public or private school, college, it is increasingly difficult for them and their families to afford higher education. Part of what has happened is that state support for higher education has gone down in recent years, shifting more of the burden onto students and their families. According to the latest report from the State Higher Education Executive Officers, public colleges experienced a 9% decrease in state funding per student from 2011 to 2012, including Minnesota. Minnesota public colleges saw a 27% decrease in state funding per student from 2007 to 2012. Meanwhile, and partially because of this, the University of Minnesota saw an increase of 65% in its average tuition and fees in constant dollars from 2002 to 2012. Our other public four-year universities saw a 47% increase in average tuition and fees. And our public two-year colleges saw a 39% increase in tuition and fees over the same time period. After more than a decade of higher education spending cuts and tuition increases in Minnesota, things have started to turn around this year. The state legislature passed a bill that increased funding for higher education in Minnesota by $250 million, including a tuition freeze at the University of Minnesota and Minnesota's other public colleges and universities for 2 years. That is very, very good news. But while this is a great victory for Minnesota students and families, it certainly won't solve the college affordability problem in Minnesota. As college has gotten more expensive, our federal student aid system has not kept up. In 1975, Pell Grants, long the cornerstone of our federal financial aid system, a full Pell Grant covered almost 80% of the cost of attending a public four-year college in 1975. But now pays for approximately 33% of the cost of a public, for a year of a public four-year college. As students have turned to student loans, more of them are ending up tens of thousands of dollars in debt. In Minnesota, I've held several college affordability roundtables and heard from a number of extraordinary students. One of them is Taylor Williams, who was a senior at the University of Minnesota this spring. He grew up in a low-income family, and he kind of was afraid of taking the advanced placement courses because he didn't think he could afford the tests, because the test cost too much money. Fortunately, Taylor had a guidance counselor who found funding to help him pay for the tests, and his success on those AP tests helped him start college with a year worth of credits. Taylor, when I talked to him, was also working 30 to 40 hours a week and receiving community scholarships. And yet, in spite of all of this, he is graduating with student debt. Because of stories like Taylor's, I recently introduced the Accelerated Learning Act, a bill to reauthorize an existing federal program that provides funding to low-income students to help pay for AP and IB International Baccalaureate exams. This is a federal program that has been around for over a decade and has helped students lower the cost of college. And I'm pleased that this legislation was included in the larger bill to reauthorize the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that we passed out of the Health Committee earlier this month. Taylor and countless other students at schools across Minnesota demonstrate tremendous perseverance and grit in getting a college education and in cobbling together the resources to pay for it. They are working incredibly hard, and they are still taking significant amounts of debt that will stay with them for a good portion of their lives. Paying for college just shouldn't have to be that hard. And in many other countries, it isn't. In fact, in many other countries, students can go to college for free, or pay extremely low tuition. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, countries where students pay zero tuition for their post-secondary education include the Czech Republic, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, Iceland, Mexico, Norway, and Sweden. Other countries like France, Austria, Switzerland, and Belgium have post-secondary systems where students have to pay tuition of less than $1,500 per year. Now, because of this, it's not a surprise that many of these countries are also surpassing the United States in higher education attainment. Not very long ago, the United States ranked first in the world in the percentage of 25 to 34-year-olds with a higher education. According to the latest data from the OECD, the United States is now 14th in that category. This is a trend we need to reverse if the United States is going to remain globally competitive. In an ideal world, the United States would provide free or extremely low-cost post-secondary education to its citizens, as so many other nations do. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So we need to take smaller but important steps to help our students pay for college. The interest rate on subsidized Stafford loans is going to double from 3.4% to 6.8% on July 1st unless Congress takes action to prevent that from happening. This interest rate would, this is an increase that would affect 200,000 students in Minnesota, almost 200,000 students in Minnesota, who would end up paying about $1,000 more for each student loan that they take out over the life of that loan. And that's above what they're already paying. At a time of record low interest rates, it makes no sense to let the student loan interest rate double. We should prevent that from happening. And ultimately, we need a long-term fix so that interest rates do not become more unaffordable for students and their families. We also need to make sure that whatever action we take doesn't make the problem worse. Several of my colleagues have proposed short-term fixes in this interest rate problem. I'm proud to support efforts by Senators Reid, Jack Reed and Tom Harkin to freeze the interest rate at 3.5% while Congress works out a longer-term solution. I'm also a proud co-sponsor of Senator Warren's legislation to tie the student loan interest rate to the rate at which the Federal Reserve lends money to banks. At a time when the Fed is lending money at an interest rate of 0.75% to banks, it makes no sense to force students to borrow money from the government at a rate of 6.8% a year or even higher. Senator Warren has been an important new voice in this debate in the Senate, making the student loan interest rates the focus of her first piece of legislation. Madam President, we need to get this done. Democratic leaders have been negotiating in good faith on this issue, and if we need to pass a short-term extension of the current interest rate to give negotiations more time to produce a solution that works for students and their families, well, then that's what we should do. Fixing the student loan interest rate is far from the only issue we have to tackle to make college more affordable for students. I just reintroduced my bipartisan Understanding the True Cost of College Act to standardize financial aid award letters among universities so that students can have clear and consistent information about the cost of their education. Students and their families and high school counselors need to have uniform financial aid letters so they can make real comparisons about college costs before deciding where the students should go to college. And that's what my bill makes possible. I also stand ready to work with my colleagues to protect the Pell Grant program and to support other programs that make college more affordable for students, like the TRIO and work-study programs. Madam President, we have a lot to do and a long way to go to make college more affordable for our students. Doing that will help more Americans find jobs to support their families, help more employers find qualified workers for their businesses, and help our economy prosper. This is one of the most critical issues that we face as a Congress, and addressing the student loan interest rate is a solid first step that we can take toward tackling this issue. Thank you Madam President, and I would yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Iowa.
In the last 3 weeks, I've pointed out several flaws in the immigration bill. Within a couple days, we'll have a bill through the Senate, and I think I owe it to my colleagues and to my constituents, since I've been pointing out flaws, what would it take for me to vote for an immigration bill? Because I'm just like most everybody, and maybe everybody in the United States Senate, that would tell you the status quo is not legitimate to maintain, and that we have to reform the system. So there are, I'd like to say, 100 senators who believe that the immigration system needs to be fixed. I can guarantee that there are also 100 different ways to fix it, and nobody has a perfect solution. But I bring an experience to the table that very few others have. My deep-rooted concern with this bill stems from my strong belief that we made a mistake in 1986. We allowed legalization and ignored the laws on the books. Another major shortcoming was that we allowed legalization without creating adequate avenues for people to enter, live, and work in this country legally. In other words, if we had a system that worked where we had a shortage of workers, if they could legally come to the country, we wouldn't have the problems we have today, and we didn't do that in 1986. These were crucial flaws that have led us to the debate that we're having the last 3 weeks, and I'm not willing to pass that mistake on to future Congresses. So what will it take for somebody like me, a senator who voted for amnesty in 1986 and wasn't a part of the group of 8 or a group of 10, to vote for an immigration reform this year? Well, this is what I need to see in an immigration bill in order to support it and send it to the President. And when I mention 4 different points, it doesn't mean that that takes care of everything, but if these things were taken care of, regardless of the other things, I would feel I'd have to support it. Legalization after border security. Secondly, meaningful interior enforcement, including allowing ICE to do its job and to work with state and local people. 3, strengthening, not weakening, current law with regard to criminals. And 4th, protecting American workers while enhancing legal avenues. And I would explain them at this point, starting with legalization after border security. Most Americans contend that a legalization program is a compassionate way to help those who are unlawfully in the country. However, those compassionate people who support such a program of legalization do so only on the premise that the government will secure the border and stop the flow of illegal migration. We are a nation based upon the rule of law. We have a right to protect our sovereignty and, of course, a duty to protect our homeland. Any border security measures we pass must be real and immediate. We can't wait 10 years to put more agents on the border or to implement a tracking system to track foreign nationals. We have to prove to the American people that illegal entries are under complete control and that visa overstays are to be punished. Unfortunately, too many people have been led to believe that this bill before us will force the Secretary of Homeland Security to secure the border. It doesn't. A fundamental component of any legislation is border security first and foremost, not legalization now and enforcement later, if ever. There has to be pressure on the executive branch to get the job done. We must tie legalization to results. Only then will advocates and a future administration truly try to secure the border. Secondly, meaningful interior enforcement, including ICE being allowed to do its job and work with state and locals. Enforcement of the immigration laws has been lax and increasingly selective in the last few years. As a result, states have been forced to deal with the criminal activity that surrounds the flow of people here undocumented. They have stepped up efforts to control the effects of illegal immigration in some states. The states should be able to protect their people and stem the lawlessness within their border. Yet time and again, this administration has denied states the opportunity and tried to stop them from enforcing immigration laws. Federal immigration enforcement officers have also been handicapped from doing their job. The bill would practically render these officers useless since they are required to verify a person's eligibility for legalization before apprehending and detaining. They need to be provided the resources to fulfill their mission and not be told by Washington to sit idly by. The unfortunate reality is that the bill does almost nothing to strengthen and enhance our interior enforcement efforts. The bill does nothing to encourage federal, state, and local law enforcement efforts to apprehend and detain individuals who pose a risk to our community. The federal government will continue to look the other way as millions of new people enter the country undocumented. Meanwhile, the bill gives the states no new authority to act when the federal government refuses. I'll be the first to say that border security is a must, but people who enter illegally and overstay their visas are residing in the interior of the country, and this cannot be ignored, and this is something that if it's fixed, I would feel very comfortable voting for an immigration bill. Strengthening, not weakening current law with regard to criminals. Now let me repeat that, without regard to criminals, because it's not going to go over well back home if you say that you can have criminal activity and be and even deported from the country and brought back and make application again to be able to have the benefits of this legislation. One of the major reasons why immigration is a subject of significant public interest is the failure of the federal government to enforce existing laws. 11 million people have unlawfully entered the country or overstayed their visas because the federal government did not deter them or take action to remove them. This bill before us significantly weakens current criminal law and will hinder the ability of law enforcement to protect Americans from criminal undocumented aliens. The bill weakens current law regarding passport fraud, only charging those who make or distribute illegal passports 3 or more times. It allows a person to knowingly purchase materials for making illegal passports, but only charge the person if a crime, if 10 or more passports are made. It also weakens current law for those who illegally enter the country, changing existing laws by removing the crime of illegally attempting to enter the United States, essentially then incentivizing foreign citizens to attempt to illegally enter the country as many times as they want. Further, once they successfully enter the U.S. illegally, the alien would only be subject to criminal punishment if they're removed from the country 3 or more times. Why isn't once enough? Taken together, the bill weakens current law and will make it easier for undocumented aliens to enter the country illegally by not criminalizing their attempts to enter nor their actual illegal entry unless they have been previously removed 3 or more times. This is a drastic change that will encourage future entries by undocumented people. Given the serious nature of criminal street gangs, we need to pass an immigration bill that prevents entry into the country if one is a gang member. More importantly, we need to ensure that gang members are not being rewarded with legal status. Regrettably, the bill is weak on foreign national criminal street gang members in several regards. In addition to weakening current law, the bill does very little to deter criminal behavior in the future. The bill ignores sanctuary cities, allowing criminals to seek safe harbor in jurisdictions where they have policies aimed to protect people in the country illegally. It increases the threshold required for actions to constitute a crime. It punishes persons only if they have already been convicted of 3 or more misdemeanors on different days. and it only punishes undocumented aliens who are removed from the country three or more times. I'm committed to making sure that any bill that is sent to the President makes a more serious effort to penalize those who attempt to enter or re-enter the United States. It needs to be tough on lawbreakers and send a signal that fraud and abuse, including identity theft, will not be tolerated. It needs to ensure that gang members are not granted legalization, but rather made deportable and inadmissible. We need to protect victims of crime and ensure that child abusers and domestic violence perpetrators do not receive benefits under the immigration law. Finally, we need to ensure that dangerous undocumented criminals are not released in our community but are detained until they are properly returned to their home country. Fourth and last, we need to protect American workers while enhancing legal avenues. While I support allowing businesses to bring in foreign workers, they should only do so when qualified Americans are not available. There have been too many stories about U.S. workers who have had to train their replacements who come in through the H-1B visa program. Foreign nationals are being hired, but then working in locations not specified in their application. Other work visa programs are not free of controversy. I agree with the creation of a temporary worker program, such as the W-visa program created in this bill. I have long argued that we must enhance and expand opportunities for people who wish to work legally in this country. Yet, as we do that, we cannot forget the American worker. We need to fight for them, ensure that they are not disadvantaged, displaced, and underpaid because of our immigration laws. The bill before the Senate makes a move in the right direction by increasing worker protection for Americans and providing more authority to the executive branch to investigate fraud in the H-1B visa program. Unfortunately, the bill is slanted to ensure that only certain employers undergo more scrutiny. All employers who bring in visa holders should be held to the same standard. All employers, not just some, should be required to make a good faith effort to recruit U.S. workers. All employers, not just some, should be required to attest that they did not or will not displace a U.S. worker within 180 days of applying for an H-1B worker. All employers, not just some, should be required to offer the job to a U.S. worker who is equally or better qualified. Our employment-based immigration program, including the H-1B program, have served and could again serve a valuable purpose if used properly. However, they're being misused and abused. They're failing the American worker and not fulfilling the original purpose that Congress intended when it was created. Reforms are needed to put integrity back into the program and to ensure that American workers and students are given every chance to fill vacant jobs in this country. Again, how I vote on final bill coming out of conference with the House is undecided. I want to be able to support something that will make Americans proud, that will not make the same mistakes we did in 1986, and will stand the test of time so that future generations can benefit. And I need to see at least these 4 key changes before I can cast a vote in support. I have said to Iowans and to my colleagues that the bill before the United States Senate is pre-cooked, but I have faith that a better bill is achievable, a bill that can gain more votes, including mine. This body, the United States Senate, is described as the most deliberative body, parliamentary body in the entire world, and I believe it is. But when we had 451 amendments offered to this bill, and we were promised free and open debate, and we've only dealt with a couple dozen of them, not a couple dozen, about a dozen of them, we can't say that we had a fair and open debate like we were promised. And it surely did not meet the standard that was set by Chairman Leahy when he promised in committee a free and open debate. And there was that free and open debate and no limit on amendments. And we stuck with it until we got done. We could have just as well stuck with this bill until we got it done, and we could have had votes on more amendments. So now we're going to pass a bill that's not the best for the country and doesn't accomplish even what the authors of the legislation hope to accomplish, particularly when they say secure the border first and then legalize. So we have to rely upon a body that is not considered a deliberative body, the House of Representatives, to correct these mistakes that are made in this bill. I think that they will. I hope that they will. And then I hope I can vote for that product that will eventually go to the President of the United States. I yield the floor.
The senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, I'd like to speak for 10 or 12 minutes as if in morning business, and then have the senator from Massachusetts, Senator Warren, recognized at the conclusion of my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you. I am very pleased to be joined on the floor of the Senate today by Senator Warren to introduce some legislation that we've been working on since 2008. Astute observers of this body will recognize that that was before Senator Warren was even Senator Warren. But she has been for years a renowned expert in consumer law and a leading advocate of reforms to protect families from predatory lending. So it's been a pleasure working with her on this bill, and I'm working with her as colleague senators now. A little history. During President Obama's first 2 years in office, and before the Republicans took control over there in the House in 2011, Democrats passed 2 significant landmark bills to protect ordinary consumers from credit card company abuses. The Credit Card Act of 2010 outlawed some of the worst tricks and traps that lenders used to squeeze money out of their customers. After that law, big banks can no longer hike interest rates on pre-existing balances just because they feel like it. And they can no longer declare that the day ends at lunchtime in order to impose late fees on payments that come in the afternoon. As absurd as it sounds, credit card companies routinely engaged in that sort of shenanigan, but the Credit Card Act put an end to a lot of it. A second bill, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act, established the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, an essential agency first proposed by Senator Warren when she was a law professor. That body will be for mortgages and credit cards, what the Consumer Product Safety Commission is for toasters and swimming pools. In an age when the fine print in a financial agreement can be the door to a family bankruptcy, this new agency is long overdue. While the Consumer Financial Protection Board is working to protect American families from many types of unfair and deceptive financial practices, including ones that involve credit card fees, the board is barred from regulating credit card interest rates. In the final negotiations on Dodd-Frank, the allies of the big credit card companies kept interest rates beyond the reach of this consumer agency. That is a shame, because unfair interest rates are a big problem for families in Rhode Island and across the nation. I have heard from so many constituents enticed to sign up for a credit card with an attractive teaser rate of 0 or 1%, and eventually the teaser period ends and the rate goes up to 12% or 15%. And if the cardholder slips up and misses a couple of payments, the rate can jump to 30% or higher. I think when most of us in this body were growing up, a 30% interest rate was a matter that you could usually take to the police because it violated state law. A rate at 30% would have been illegal under the laws of most, if not all, of the 50 states. But the Supreme Court came in 1978, and they ruled that the Civil War-era National Bank Act only required a lender, the credit card issuer, to abide by the law of the state that's their home state.
and allowed them to ignore the law of the state that their customer called their home state. Well, it didn't take too long for the big credit card companies to see the loophole. This meant that if they moved their legal home to states with no interest rate limits, with lousy consumer protections, even dealing with those states to reduce the consumer protection as a consequence of moving there, well, from these new havens, they could lend to people in all 50 states at any interest rate they wanted. Since that Supreme Court decision, which is called the Marquette ruling, high interest rate credit cards have mushroomed and consumer debt has soared. According to the Federal Reserve, in the year before the Marquette decision, 1977, only 38% of families had a bank-issued credit card. By 2010, over 65% had credit cards, with about a third of all families holding 4 or more credit cards. And the debt numbers coming off of those credit cards are even worse. Revolving consumer debt, which is mainly credit card debt, has exploded over 20-fold in the 35 years since the Marquette decision. This little bullseye represents the debt beforehand, the giant red circle, the debt afterwards. And the credit card companies are taking full advantage. Interest rates, as we know, are generally low right now. Banks are lending to one another at less than 0.25%. 30-year fixed mortgage rates are near 4%. Savings bonds pay a paltry 1%. The Stafford loans we're discussing will move from 3.4% to 6.8% if we don't act. But credit cards? According to Bankrate.com, which tracks lending statistics, the average variable rate credit card now charges over 15%, and many consumers pay much higher rates. At 15% interest, it would take a family paying the monthly minimum, which is often equal to 1% of the balance plus the accrued interest. It would take that family more than 22 years to pay off a $5,000 balance. An emergency comes to your family, you need to go to your credit card to pay for it, you have to run up $5,000, 22 years to dig out from that at a 15% rate. Over those 20 years, the total you'd pay would be almost $11,000, meaning that interest rate charges would be more than the actual balance that you owed, which is bad enough, but imagine a family paying 30%. For them, it's much worse. It would take 25 years to pay off a $5,000 balance, making minimum payments, and the total payments the family would have to make would add up to $17,000, more than triple the $5,000 that was borrowed. Families may turn to credit cards in times of emergency, and then when they get back on their feet, find the next quarter of a century dedicated to paying off that debt. We should act to ensure that families don't suffer lost decades to unnecessarily and what would once have been illegally high interest rates. The bill we introduced today, the Restoring States' Rights to Protect Their Consumers Act, would not set a federal interest rate cap, but it would restore to our sovereign 50 states their historic right, a right that dated back to their status as colonies before the Revolution, to determine what interest rate limits should apply and protect their own citizens. This bill is 2 pages long. It is simple. It is a states' rights bill. It received bipartisan support when I offered it as an amendment to the Dodd-Frank bill, and I hope senators of both parties will consider supporting it now. I'll now yield the floor to my lead co-sponsor, Senator Warren of Massachusetts, with my thanks to her for her leadership in protecting American consumers and for her help in drafting this measure. It is a privilege to serve with Senator Warren in the Senate. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator